Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. We get to talk about the latest Zelda release today, and that is always a good time. The remaster of Skyward Sword is out now on Nintendo Switch, and that game is really quite beloved. The Wii original has a Metacritic average of 93, and while that is actually a relatively low score for the series, it is still 93 out of 100 on average. That's like saying Eyes Wide Shut is one of Stanley Kubrick's lower rated films. It is, but it is also a Stanley Kubrick film and is loved by an awful lot of people. I do like to throw Eyes Wide Shut mentions in there wherever I can. That's my excuse this week. Anyway, I never actually reviewed Skyward Sword myself, so this is the first time I've shared opinions on it anywhere as far as I can remember. You can check out my review on digitallydownloaded.net for my full thoughts. But what I'll do with this video is instead talk a lot more narrowly about one thing, which unfortunately does annoy the hell out of me with regards to Skyward Sword. And I really can't believe they haven't used this remake as an opportunity to really kind of address it. And that is the controls. See, Skyward Sword was originally designed to use the Wii's motion control. And in a manner of speaking, it worked for that console, but I've never been a fan of motion controls personally. So, with this Switch remaster, I have been playing using the button controls. They're entirely new to this edition, but they've been implemented so horribly that it's quite clear that the default way that Nintendo wants you to play the game is still using the motion controls, to the point that I wonder why they bothered to put button controls in at all. They are that bad. They are just so annoying. To take the most basic example of the most basic control requirement of any 3D game, the camera. On literally any other game on Nintendo Switch, and any other game that you'll play on any other console in the modern era, the camera is controlled using the right stick. But with Skyward Sword, that's not to be. Oh no. The right stick controls your sword movement when you've got it drawn. To move the camera around, you're going to have to press down a shoulder button and then manipulate the right stick on top of that. Now that's annoying enough when you've already got to look around while you're moving, because you've got to hold down a button the whole time. But on top of that, there's something in the coding that means quite often the game fails to register the shoulder button press for a fraction of a moment. So what happens is you still have control over the camera for whatever reason, but just in the middle of nowhere while he's running around, Link's going to draw his sword out. Now that doesn't really impact on the gameplay, but it comes across as a very annoying visual bug, and I just couldn't get over that the entire time I was playing. Every time I had to manipulate this camera, I got the sense that Link was about to draw his sword where I didn't intend him to. And again, that doesn't have an impact on the gameplay, but as a visual immersion thing, it really does break entirely with what I was hoping to get out of this game. That's not the only inefficiency in the controls either. Picking up and throwing things, for example. To do that, you're going to have to press down a button to pick the thing up, flick the control stick, the same one that you use for the sword and camera, to summon the throwing arc outline, and then press another button to actually throw the thing. The biggest problem with this inefficiency is that it starts to overload the right control stick with things to do, and when it does that, it becomes very hard as the player to remember the exact order that you need to press things, and so on and so forth. I found as I was playing for a long time, right up until the end really, there were times where I'd be picking up pots to smash them, and Link would accidentally put them down because I pressed the buttons in the wrong order, and it was just a very unintuitive system for this throwing system. In terms of something that is more meaningfully impactful on the actual mechanics of the game, there's also the absolutely critical shield parry button, where timing is everything. If you've ever played a game in which the parry is an important mechanic, you know that you have to be able to time things perfectly. When you want to do the parry, you press the button and it works immediately. Now with this game, with Skyward Sword, that button is mapped to the control stick press down button. And that is one of the most cumbersome of all buttons to actually time and press. So what happened was, so often I'd be trying to parry, and because I'd time things wrong in either way, or it'd just take me a little bit too long to actually click things down, especially when I was moving around at the same time, I ended up mistiming the parry, which of course meant that Link got hit, the shield got damaged, and all those other things. It became a very annoying mechanic to try and grapple with. Now I can give other examples, but the point here is that actually learning how to play Skyward Sword means unlearning about 99% of the other games that get made these days. And what do you get in return for that inconvenience? Well, when it comes down to it, you get a very approximate attempt to emulate motion controls using button presses and controller stick waggles, and that comes across as very loose and unresponsive. It feels very button mashy, and that's very unusual for Nintendo. With Nintendo, we're so used to the control systems being beautifully elegant and responsive that this thing comes across as a distinctly non-Nintendo solution to the lack of motion controls, or the fact that there would be a lot of people that would be playing without motion controls. Because remember, if you're playing this on the Switch Lite or whatever, your ability to play with motion controls is pretty inhibited. They needed this button control solution, but the solution that they've come up with just doesn't feel as precise as we would expect from Nintendo, especially with Zelda, its premier franchise. Motion controls themselves are not a problem. They're a visceral thing that is enjoyable in isolation. You swing and the sword tracks your motion. That's fun. That is really good fun. But it's also got to be used in an interesting way, and when you take the motion out of it, it kind of reveals the weaknesses of the combat system and highlights something which is not overly pleasant about Skyward Sword. Ultimately, what you're trying to do in this game is hit unprotected spots in enemy defenses. And the enemy defenses have spots on different points of the body, and you need to change the angle of your strike to hit those spots. You might need to strike low up, down, left, right, left, and swing around and around. And you might need to change it dynamically during the combat based on where the enemy weaknesses has appeared. That's fine if it's motion controls, because you can actually shift your body around to take account of it. But when you're doing it with control sticks and stuff, once again you start to feel like you just need to waggle the controller around, and it feels very loose and unresponsive. So that combat system, which works under a motion control system, doesn't feel anywhere near as engaging when it has been reduced to button presses. Which brings me to a point that I want to make using this video. I want to talk a bit about remakes and remasters. Nintendo has done a good job in giving Skyward Sword a visual upgrade. It's not the most spectacular looking game on the Switch, but it does have a nice aesthetic and a colourful vibrancy to it. But when we talk about remasters and remakes, is the only thing that we're talking about the visual side of things. Why didn't Nintendo use this as an opportunity to take Skyward Sword and do a ground up rework of it to make it work as well as other Zelda games do without the motion controls? Would that have been a big project? Yes, of course. But then taking a Game Boy game and putting it into 3D as they did with Link's Awakening a few years ago was also a very big project. Nintendo can do that. They've certainly got the resources. They could have done a ground up remake of the control system to make this Skyward Sword remaster really feel like a remaster and something that has been updated for the modern era where we don't do motion controls so much. Because we are being asked to buy this game again, and while the Switch can do motion controls, that's a fad that has kind of passed now, and people aren't overly interested in playing games that way. It would have made much more sense to me for the preservation of Skyward Sword as a game to make the button-based controls the default way to play here, and then worked at making sure that they were as enjoyable in action as the button-based controls in Breath of the Wild or any of the other Zelda games. Because in other ways, Skyward Sword has had a bunch of improvements done to it, not just the visuals. Autosave modernizes the way that the save game system works. Nintendo has also found the time and energy to turn an amiibo into a quality of life, quick travel feature, locked away as physical DLC as it is. So Nintendo has done things to the gameplay to modernize it and make it play like you would expect from a game in 2021. So again, why not fix the controls too? Now, some would argue that the controls make the game what it is, but I would ask, what do the motion controls really genuinely add to Skyward Sword? Not that much, I would suggest. The Dragon Quest VR thing I did in Japan a couple of years ago, where you got to swing a physical sword around and my movements were recreated in this full VR world, that was something that added to the Dragon Quest experience in a meaningful way that you couldn't emulate in any other way. But with this, it all feels like a gimmick, or at best, an experiment that affirmed how every other Zelda game is better off without motion controls. So again, I would suggest that if Nintendo was to take Skyward Sword, break it back down to its components and then rebuild it with this new control system that was button-based, people would reevaluate the rest of Skyward Sword in a much more positive light, because it's not relying on this fundamentally shallow kind of motion control experience that didn't really add anything meaningful to the game. Now, with all of that said, I do think that this is an excellent game still, and I've got to put that disclaimer in because I know I've been critical of a Zelda game here, and you're just not allowed to do that with the video game world. As you will see in my review on digitallydownloaded.net, I am very positive about this game because I think everything else about it is deserving of more recognition than it probably gets because people get fixated on the control thing. But the narrative is great, the setting's great, the concept of there being two worlds above and below is nice. It's almost like a Ghibli-like quality. And the fact that this is the very first story in the Zelda series chronologically makes it all works as a kind of origin story. I think it's quite beautiful in a lot of ways and deserves to be talked about in ways that aren't related to the controls, which is ironic, I know, because I've just spent this video talking about the controls. But again, I've written a review on digitallydownloaded.net that doesn't really mention the controls at all, so check that out, please. And as I said at the start of the video, Skyward Sword might be the least of the Zelda games, but it is still a Zelda game, and when the series is at its worst, it's still one of the best out there. And with that, I think that's enough for this video. Thank you as always for tuning in. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you like the motion controls, please do let me know, because I'd be very interested in hearing what you think the motion controls actually added to Skyward Sword, and whether you will be playing this remake using the button controls instead, just to see what it's like. Please do click that like and subscribe button if you've enjoyed this video or enjoy my work in general. That way you won't miss any as I put them up. And please consider backing me on Patreon. You can do so for just $1 a month or a little bit more if you're feeling generous. And in doing so, you actually get access to a 48-page monthly magazine. The next one actually comes out in a couple of days, so you'll be able to check that out. It's, like I said, it's 48 pages, and it doesn't just look at video games, it also looks at just about everything to do with Japanese art. So we're talking about travel, we're talking about geography, we're talking about history, we're talking about film, literature, music, food and alcohol. We really do cover the whole lot with that magazine. So it's interesting if you're into Japanese games on any level, then you'll find that this magazine will help you, I guess, enjoy the context that produces these games a lot more. Anyhow, once again, that's enough for this video. Thank you as always for tuning in. We'll see you next time.